You are no longer part of this family. We will move on without you. Do not come back. Those were the exact words glowing on my phone screen in the dead of night. My own son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man I had entrusted with the keys to my life's work. He had just erased me with a few careless taps of his thumb. I sat there in the heavy silence of a sterile, unfamiliar hotel room on the outskirts of Houston, the harsh light of the screen reflecting off my tired eyes. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not shatter the bedside lamp in a fit of rage. I simply stared at the message, took a long, slow breath, and typed a single word in reply. Okay. I hit send. Then I laid the phone face down on the scuffed laminate nightstand. The quiet that settled in was suffocating, yet behind my eyes everything was sharp, calculated. Nathan was certain he'd come out on top. He and Paige had convinced themselves they'd disposed of a frail, powerless 75-year-old man without a fight left in him. Earlier that same day, they'd changed the locks on my own front door and thrust a forged medical power of attorney at me like it settled everything. They looked at the gray at my temples and the hospital bracelet still on my wrist and read it all as defeat. What they missed, what they never once stopped to consider, was who actually broke that ground. I raised that commercial real estate empire out of nothing, deal by deal, acre by acre. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. I unzipped my battered canvas duffel bag and lifted out my encrypted laptop. The screen bloomed to life, its blue glow throwing cold shadows against the water-stained plaster walls of the room. These hands of mine, roughened over decades of gripping contractors' handshakes, executing multi-million-dollar land deals, and treading the concrete floors of sprawling warehouses across Texas, held perfectly still. I pulled up my private secure terminal and reached for my phone a second time, dialing the round-the-clock wealth management line at my private bank. When your liquid holdings are what mine are, nobody lets it ring twice. A measured professional voice came through. Mr. Drummond, good evening. How can we assist you tonight? I drew a slow breath and steadied myself. I need to initiate a Level 4 total asset freeze on the primary corporate portfolio and all associated subsidiary accounts. The words left me flat and cold, barely a ripple of emotion, the empty room giving them a faint echo. On his end, the representative went quiet for just a beat. I caught the soft, rapid tapping of keys. He was looking at the numbers. 8 figures. Sir, I just need to verify your security protocols for a freeze of this magnitude. This will suspend all outgoing wires, disable all corporate credit lines, and lock the escrow accounts. Are you certain you wish to proceed? I am certain. I read off my alphanumeric passcodes. I worked through every layer of the security questions. I pushed the biometric confirmation through the encrypted app. Under 3 minutes, start to finish. The financial lifeblood of a 30-year-old empire went dark. Every corporate platinum card riding in Nathan's wallet, every liquid cash account he imagined was his to command every credit line bearing the Drummond name, all of it locked, immovable. No wire could leave, not without my body in the room, my voice on the line, and my signature on the page. Nathan had fired off that vicious text, convinced he was finally free of me, that the millions he believed he'd taken were his to spend. Welcome back to Dadrevenge. I'm glad you're here for this one because this is a story that stayed with me long after it ended. Before we get into it, drop a single word in the comments, just one word that describes how you're feeling right now. Whatever is sitting on your chest today, I'd genuinely like to know. Now, a quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. While he was almost certainly uncorking expensive champagne in my own living room, toasting his supposed victory with Paige, I was sitting in a dim hotel room, quietly dismantling his entire world. I eased the laptop shut with a soft click and sank back into the stiff hotel chair. For the first time since morning, something that almost resembled a smile crossed my face, a grim one. I filled a glass from the bathroom tap and let the cold water work its way down my dry, tight throat. A few weeks earlier, I had survived a mild stroke. The specialists had been clear: no stress, full rest, let the family step in. Nathan was meant to be running the company with integrity while I got back on my feet. What he did instead was treat my medical crisis as an opening, forging legal documents, buying off a corrupt doctor, engineering a path to dump me in an assisted living facility. He wanted me gone so badly, he had the locks changed on the custom-built estate I paid for in cash 40 years ago. Rest was no longer the agenda. Survival was. Protecting everything I had built from a man who happened to carry my last name. I glanced at my phone lying still on the nightstand. The silence wouldn't hold. I knew exactly what was bearing down. The trap had been set. The accounts were sealed. The poison pill I had buried inside the company's operating agreement years ago was fully armed and waiting. Let me take you back to just 72 hours before this moment. 72 hours before I sat in that dim hotel room and froze my own life's work. 72 hours before the illusion of a perfect family cracked apart in every direction. Because before the next sunrise, my phone would light up again, not from some dismissive text, but from 43 desperate missed calls. A son who had just discovered he was sealed inside a cage he'd built around himself. By then, it would be far too late to matter. The first gray light of dawn slipped through the gap in the cheap hotel curtains, falling in a pale strip across the foot of the bed. I hadn't closed my eyes once. Every time I tried, that text message replayed behind my lids on an endless loop. My body was exhausted. My mind was razor-sharp, sharper maybe than it had been in years. At exactly 6 louder in the morning, the room's silence cracked open with a hard, aggressive buzzing. I turned slowly toward the nightstand. The phone screen blazed white, a name pulsing across it that I had once spoken with nothing but pride. Nathan. I watched the phone walk itself toward the edge of the nightstand with each vibration. I didn't reach for it. I let it run. It died out for a few seconds, then started all over again. Then again, and again. Finally, I reached over, unlocked the screen, and looked at the banner. 43 missed calls. 43 frantic attempts to reach the man he had banished from his life the night before. I could picture it clearly, him standing at an airport counter, the color gone from his face, every platinum card bouncing the full weight of his situation, landing on those arrogant shoulders all at once. He was cornered. The empire he believed he'd taken was a locked vault, and the only key was in my possession. I swiped the notification gone and set the phone back down. I wasn't ready to hear his voice yet. Let him stew. Let him wear grooves into the airport terminal floor in a panic. Let him taste a fraction of the suffocating helplessness he'd tried to bury me in just hours before. Now, to understand the sheer audacity behind those 43 missed calls, you need to know where this all began. Let me take you back 72 hours to a time when I still believed I had a son who loved me. 3 days before all of this, everything felt completely different. I was sitting on the edge of a crisp white bed inside an upscale rehabilitation clinic in the Woodlands. The air carried that particular mix of sterile alcohol wipes and eucalyptus air freshener that never quite lets you forget you're in a medical facility. 2 weeks earlier, a sudden crushing tightness in my chest and a deadness spreading through my left arm had put me in an emergency room. A mild stroke, they called it. My own body firing a warning across the bow after 50 years of relentless work. But I'd bounced back quickly. My speech was clean. My coordination was fully intact. The physical therapist had remarked more than once that sheer stubbornness was probably doing half the work. That morning, my primary care physician walked in wearing a warm smile and carrying a signed clipboard. Final neurological checks had come back clean. I was cleared to go home 2 days ahead of schedule. A wave of relief moved through me that I hadn't expected to feel quite so deeply. All I wanted was my own bed, my leather chair, and the view out over the gardens I had put in the ground with my late wife. I decided against calling Nathan or Paige to come get me. They'd been showing up at the clinic regularly, performing deep concern, hauling in expensive fruit baskets, reassuring me between bites that the business was perfectly handled. I wanted to walk through the front door unannounced. I wanted them to see the old man standing on his own feet, ready to take back the wheel. I packed my battered canvas duffel bag, signed the discharge paperwork, and stepped through the clinic's glass doors into the warm Texas sun. I pulled out my phone and booked a premium ride service. When the silver sedan arrived, I got in feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, a quiet, solid sense of purpose. Heading down the highway toward home, I watched Houston through the tinted glass. The towers of steel and glass, the sprawling commercial distribution centers pushing out toward the horizon. I had shaped a meaningful piece of that landscape. Started with absolutely nothing. Put in 100-hour weeks for years, trading sleep and comfort for a real estate portfolio that handed my family a life most people never see. I gave Nathan every advantage I never had. Private schools, luxury cars, a guaranteed executive seat at my firm the moment he held his diploma. I believed I was being a good father by clearing the road ahead of him. It never once occurred to me that removing every obstacle had produced a man with no grasp of what a dollar costs, or what loyalty even means. The sedan turned off the highway and onto the hushed, tree-lined street leading to my neighborhood. Thick oaks spread their branches over the manicured lawns on either side. We rolled up to the wrought iron gates of my property. The house stood well back from the street, a sprawling custom stone mansion that represented every year of sacrifice I had ever made. I tipped the driver, pulled my bag from the trunk, and stepped out onto the wide cobblestone drive. The morning air was cool and clean, laced with the scent of the flowering crepe myrtles I had planted decades ago. I walked toward the heavy front door, fishing my keys from my pocket. I was smiling, genuinely looking forward to the surprise on my son's face. I had no idea I was walking straight into a trap that had been carefully laid for me. I slid my familiar brass key into the lock of the heavy oak door. Something was wrong immediately. The mechanism that my hand had known for decades felt stiff, unresponsive. I worked the key back and forth, Texas humidity warping the frame maybe, but it found nothing to catch on. I pulled it out, cleaned it off against my slacks, tried once more. Nothing. A cold, sinking feeling took hold in my stomach. This was the house where I had lived my entire adult life. I knew the sound every floorboard made, every worn groove in that doorframe. This wasn't a jammed lock. Someone had put in a new one entirely. I knocked hard on the door, the sound carrying into the quiet morning air. I expected my housekeeper's quick footsteps. Instead, I heard the deliberate, heavy tread of a man crossing the floor. The deadbolt turned. The door pulled open to reveal my son, Nathan. He was wearing an expensive designer suit I had almost certainly paid for, a plain ceramic mug in his hand. There was no surprise on his face, no warmth. He stood squarely in the doorway, shoulders filling the frame, making no move to let me in. Before I could get a single word out, Paige materialized at his side. She had on her pressed linen sundress, every inch the polished, wealthy housewife she performed for the world. No embrace. Instead, she tilted her head and arranged her face into something sweetly, poisonously patient the expression you'd use on a confused child who needed gentle correction. She asked what I was doing there, her voice coated in manufactured concern. She pointed out that my discharge wasn't scheduled until Friday. I leaned past them, trying to catch a glimpse of my own foyer. I asked where my housekeeper was keeping my voice level, but letting the edge show. I wanted to know why my key wouldn't turn in my own front door. I told Nathan to move, that I was tired, and simply wanted to sit down in my own living room. He didn't shift an inch. He lifted the cold brew slowly to his lips, then looked down at me with an expression I had never once seen on his face. Pure, undisguised contempt. He told me calmly that I wasn't coming in. Not a trace of hesitation in his voice. My blood pressure climbed. My mind kept bumping against the raw audacity of it. I reminded him that I had built this house with my own hands and paid for every square foot of ground he was standing on. I told him to get out of my way. Paige reached over and laid a light hand on his arm, then eased herself forward just enough to deliver the real blow. She told me not to get worked up bad for my heart, she said. She claimed they had planned to tell me the following day. In that same chilling even tone, she explained that my things had already been moved to a premium assisted living facility out in the suburbs. Round-the-clock professional care, she said. Beautiful gardens. People my own age. They had secured the finest suite the place offered. Then she looked straight at me and said I needed proper care now after the stroke, and that the time had come for me to step back and let Nathan carry the burden of the business. The words moved through me like ice water. Assisted living. I was a 75-year-old man who ran a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate operation. I had walked out of that clinic less than an hour ago with a clean bill of health. My mind was sharp enough to navigate complex zoning disputes and corporate mergers. I didn't need someone to spoon-feed me. I needed my son to stand aside. I let my voice drop low, quiet, and dangerous, and told them this was not up for discussion. You do not box up a man's belongings and ship him to a retirement home without his agreement. I told them both to clear the doorway before I called the police and had them removed from my property for trespassing. Nathan produced a short, hollow laugh, a sound that put cold in my chest. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and drew out a thick fold of legal papers. He snapped them open with a flick of his wrist and held them up in the morning light just beyond my reach. Don't bother with the police, he told me, his tone sliding from dismissive to something openly hostile. If officers showed up, he said they wouldn't be taking him or Paige anywhere. They'd be walking me straight to a psychiatric ward. I read the heavy black type at the top of the page. Power of attorney. Clipped beneath it a medical certificate letterhead from the very hospital I had spent the past 2 weeks in. I read the bolded summary of the diagnosis. Advanced cognitive decline. Dementia. The signature at the bottom was a neurologist I had met exactly once on my first night in the intensive care unit. The ground seemed to shift under me. I demanded to know what this was, my hands tightening into fists. I called it a fabrication, every word of it. I said my own physician had cleared me not an hour ago, a mild heart episode, nothing more. No dementia. Paige sighed, shook her head, and turned to Nathan like I wasn't standing there. She said I was getting confused again. The doctors had warned them, she claimed, that I might have these aggressive episodes, these lapses. I told her to stop addressing me like I was something she'd found wandering a parking lot. I knew my own mind. I had never signed any power of attorney handing them control over my life or my estate. Nathan stepped closer to the threshold, his height pressing into the space between us. He whispered that I had, and a cruel smile pulled at his mouth as he said it. 3 days ago, he told me with a notary right there in the room. My mind scrambled back through the past few days. I landed on a Tuesday afternoon. The pain medication had been especially heavy that day, leaving me sluggish and confused at the edges. Nathan had walked into my hospital room carrying a stack of clipboards, routine insurance authorization forms he'd said paperwork the clinic required to keep my private suite covered. He had guided my hand to the signature lines one by one, telling me he was just handling the administrative tedium so I could sleep. He had weaponized my trust. He had used my helplessness to strip me of everything I owned. The full weight of that betrayal pressed down onto my chest, like something physical. I looked at the boy I had raised, the son I had handed every possible advantage, and told him he had tricked me. He had sat at my bedside, taken my hand, and robbed me while I was sedated. Nathan fired back that he was protecting family assets from a man who was clearly past his time. His eyes had gone flat and greedy. He said I'd have worked until I dropped and dragged the whole company down with me, and that he'd simply moved things along. The documents were airtight, he told me. The doctor had testified that the stroke had compromised my judgment. The notary had witnessed my signature. He controlled the real estate firm, the bank accounts, and the house. Then came the final warning. If I set one foot past the threshold, he would call emergency services on the spot. He'd tell them his father, a dementia patient, had wandered away from his care facility and was becoming aggressive. They would put me on a psychiatric hold in a state-run facility, he promised, and I would never breathe open air again. I stood on the cobblestone drive with the Texas sun pressing warm on my back, and I had never felt so cold. I was looking into the face of something I had built. He had constructed this flawlessly. Medical records, legal authority, and physical possession of the property. Any scene I caused, any raised voice, any shove would only feed the story they had written about me. I would look exactly like the unhinged, deteriorating old man those documents described. Paige stood at his shoulder with her arms folded, satisfaction sitting plainly on her face. The silence between us stretched and thickened. A lesser man might have come apart right there on that driveway. A lesser man might have dropped to his knees and begged his own blood for a corner of his own home, some small place to finish out his years. But as I held Nathan's arrogant gaze, the shock behind my eyes was quietly replaced by something else entirely. A cold, absolute clarity. He believed a few forged signatures and a bribed physician were enough to bring down a man who had fought in brutal corporate trenches for 40 years. He had the paperwork. He did not have the faintest grasp of what he was actually reaching for. I didn't scream. I didn't swing. I gave them nothing, not a single crumb of the reaction they had been counting on. Instead, I breathed. One slow, deliberate breath, steadying everything behind my ribs. I adjusted the strap of my battered canvas duffel bag and looked my son straight in the eye. I caught it, just a flicker of uncertainty moving through his confidence. He had braced for a fight, for a collapse. My stillness rattled him. I turned away without another word. I walked back down the cobblestone path through the wrought iron gates and out of my own estate. I could feel their eyes tracking me the whole way, but I never looked back. I took out my phone, called another car, and gave the driver the address of the nearest business hotel. They believed I was retreating. They believed they had quietly packed a man off to a life of slow, forgotten desperation. But sitting in the back of that car, watching my neighborhood recede through the rear window, the grief inside me hardened into something else entirely. A weapon. They had no concept that their tidy little scheme was merely the opening move in a contest they were never equipped to win. The silver sedan glided quietly through the familiar streets, carrying me away from the only home I had known for 4 decades. I watched the manicured lawns slide past the tinted glass. I knew precisely what was unfolding back at the estate. Nathan and Paige were almost certainly standing in my grand foyer at that very moment, cracking open my most expensive scotch and touching crystal glasses in a triumphant toast. My silence on the driveway had read to them as total collapse confirmation that I was too broken, too sick, and too exhausted to contest their clever legal play. There is something genuinely dangerous about underestimating a man who has nothing left to defend but his legacy. Their arrogance was the crack in their foundation. They assumed I fought the way they did, loud, messy, and out in the open, but my entire career had been built in the shadows, anticipating opponents 3 moves ahead, committing to a strike only when the outcome was already decided. You don't raise a commercial real estate empire by losing your composure on a front porch. You build it through the discipline of the quiet, well-timed blow. I leaned forward and gave the driver a specific address, a corporate hotel downtown, one I knew had high-speed encrypted internet access in its business suites. 20 minutes later, I was standing at the front desk. The clerk passed me a key card, with a pleasant smile, having no idea that the older man in front of him had just been expelled from his own home by his own child. I rode the elevator to the 14th floor and followed the carpeted corridor to my room. When I stepped inside, the space offered nothing in the way of warmth. A standard corporate suite, muted grays and beiges, a heavy wooden desk, positioned in front of a wide window with a view over the Houston skyline spreading below. Nothing like the custom oak paneling and worn leather of my home office, but it would do everything I needed it to do. This was no longer a room to recover in. It was about to become my command center. I set my battered canvas duffel bag on the edge of the bed and moved directly to the desk. I didn't unpack, didn't flip on the television, didn't even shed my jacket. The fatigue that had been trailing me since the clinic discharge had burned off, completely replaced by a cold, focused energy pushing hard through my veins. The grief of watching my son, consumed by greed, sat like a stone in my chest, but I pressed it down beneath layers of sheer resolve. There would be a season for mourning what this family had become. That season was not now. I had an empire to protect. I unzipped the side pocket of my bag and drew out the laptop, a heavy military-grade machine built to my exact security specifications. I plugged in the power cable and pressed the button. The screen came alive, throwing a hard blue light across my face. I connected to the secure network and navigated to the main login portal for Drummond Commercial Real Estate and Logistics. The corporate logo, a steel bridge I had sketched on a cocktail napkin 30 years ago, appeared on screen. I entered my standard executive credentials. The screen hung for a fraction of a second before a bright red message filled the display. Access denied. Account suspended. A dry, humorless sound came out of me. Nathan had actually moved on it. No delay whatsoever. The moment that forged power of attorney had been pushed through, he must have gone straight to the IT department and had me locked out of the front-end system. He probably felt sharp about that, convinced he had severed my connection to the company entirely. But Nathan was a vice president who had received his title as a gift. He understood how to operate the machine. He had no idea how it had been assembled. What he didn't know was that 10 years ago, when we rebuilt the entire digital infrastructure from the ground up, I had sat privately with our lead network architect and mandated the creation of a ghost protocol, an invisible, untraceable backdoor buried deep in the server code, engineered for exactly this kind of catastrophic scenario. A hostile, internal takeover. I closed the main portal and pulled up a blank command terminal. The screen went black, waiting. I cracked my knuckles in the stillness of that hotel room and began typing. Line after line of code threaded past the standard firewalls and worked through the security architecture Nathan believed was sealed tight. The terminal asked for secondary biometric verification. I pressed my thumb to the scanner. A green light blinked. The system confirmed who I was, and just like that, the walls came down. The black screen fell away, and in its place rose the raw, unfiltered master dashboard of my entire corporate network. Every bank account, every active real estate contract, every internal message chain, every dollar of liquid capital, all of it spread out before me in real time. I was in. Nathan had bolted the front door. He had not thought to check for another way inside. The company's digital footprint was enormous, but I knew exactly where to walk. I went straight to the executive transaction logs and filtered for activity over the past 14 days, the precise window of my hospital stay. I needed to see what my son had been doing while I was flat on my back. The cursor held steady while the server worked through the request. The search for the truth had begun. The data assembled itself on screen in clean, glowing rows. To anyone else, it would have resembled a numbingly dull corporate spreadsheet. To me, those figures were a pulse, the living vital signs of everything I had built. I could read the health of the operation in the movement of capital, the cadence of payroll transfers, the texture of routine expenses. I moved closer to the monitor, the screen's cold light catching my eyes, and began scrolling through the executive logs from the precise moment my ambulance had left the corporate offices 2 weeks prior. I expected incompetence. Bloated expense reports, maybe a frivolous vehicle purchase, a generous bonus Nathan had quietly signed for himself the instant he thought the seat was his. Greed I was ready for. What was staring back at me, I was not. I opened the primary operating ledger, the account we ran daily contractor payments and property maintenance through. The balance was shockingly depleted. I highlighted a cluster of transactions dated just 3 days after my stroke and felt my jaw tighten. A wire transfer for $50,000. The recipient was a vendor name I had never encountered, a generic corporate title with no prior history in our records whatsoever. I pulled up the attached invoice. A crude, vaguely worded document billing for consulting services. Nathan hadn't even bothered constructing a convincing cover. 2 days on from that, another transfer appeared. $75,000 routed to a different unknown account. Then $100,000. Then another $100,000. The transfers were coming almost every other day, draining the operating account with a kind of reckless, frantic energy. I opened the calculator and began feeding the figures in. The clicking of my keys moved through the silence of that hotel room like a metronome counting down to something terrible. $50,000, then $75,000, then $100,000, then $120,000. The total kept climbing, a digital record of my son's treachery, stacking up line by line. When I entered the final transaction logged just yesterday afternoon, the number settled on the screen like a verdict. Over $500,000 in liquid cash had left the corporate accounts in 14 days. $500,000 gone. I leaned back in the desk chair and pressed my palms against my tired eyes. A cold sweat gathered at the back of my neck. This wasn't a spoiled heir blowing money on watches and private dinners. You don't move $500,000 through untraceable wire transfers across a 2-week span just to sustain a lavish lifestyle. This was something more desperate, more frantic. The erratic spacing of the transfers, the sloppily fabricated invoices, the sheer pace of it all. It assembled into one specific and alarming picture. Nathan wasn't simply greedy. Nathan was frightened out of his mind. I leaned forward again, my thoughts moving hard through the possibilities. In high-stakes real estate, $500,000 in liquid cash is a meaningful sum, but it is not the number a man walks away on. That kind of money is not enough to walk away from a multi-million-dollar company for, which meant the stolen cash was not a safety net. It was a tourniquet. Nathan was throwing corporate funds into a fire somewhere, buying himself time, but time against what? Who was he paying? And why was the desperation so legible in his own digital trail? The instinct that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind since I stood on that cobblestone driveway sharpened into something undeniable, pushing me out of my home and ramming through that fraudulent power of attorney that was not the destination. It was the setup. Nathan hadn't locked me out because he wanted my desk and my title. He locked me out because he was in immediate, desperate trouble, and he needed unobstructed access to the company's deepest reserves to save himself. He needed me declared mentally unfit, so I couldn't intervene and stop the bleeding before he finished whatever catastrophic move he was in the middle of making. I sat there staring at that blinking cursor, grief and cold fury braided together in my chest. My son was not merely a thief. He was a drowning man, and he had grabbed my life's work as a flotation device, fully willing to pull me under to keep his own head above water. The $500,000 was only the beginning, the frantic thrashing of someone who already knew the walls were closing in. If he was this far gone, he wouldn't stop at the liquid cash. He would go after the structural pillars, the heavy assets that held the whole enterprise upright. I closed the ledger and navigated to the master asset portfolio, the vault containing property deeds, long-term investments, and the multi-million-dollar holdings at the company's core. My hands were not entirely steady as I worked through the digital security layers. If Nathan had reached this level, the damage could be something I couldn't undo. I filtered for any pending contracts, active listings, or fresh appraisals initiated within the past 2 weeks. The server labored through the data request. The loading indicator spun on the screen like it had all the time in the world. I sat with my breath held, willing my instincts to be wrong, willing the destruction to be confined to the cash accounts. But when the screen refreshed and the new figures assembled themselves across the dashboard, the color left my face entirely. The $500,000 looked like a rounding error against what I was looking at now. I clicked into the master folder marked Pending Acquisitions and Liquidations. The system paused, almost as if reluctant to present the full scope of the wreckage. When the page resolved, my eyes went straight to 2 specific addresses at the top of the list. Both were flagged in bright yellow priority fast-track processing. The air went out of me. These were not aging strip malls or redundant office parks. These were the twin South Houston distribution centers, the absolute crown jewels of everything I had assembled over a lifetime. I had bought that land 30 years ago, when the area was nothing but scrub and open dirt. I had personally stood over the pouring of every square foot of concrete on those sites. I had negotiated the anchor leases with multinational logistics companies, contracts that had kept the company insulated and profitable through 3 separate economic recessions. Massive state-of-the-art facilities covering hundreds of thousands of square feet. The beating heart of my entire operation, and my son was moving to sell them. My hands were shaking as I opened the attached contracts. I had to see the terms. I had to know who the buyer was, and more critically, what price had been agreed to. In a stable market, those 2 properties together would appraise comfortably above $25 million. In the current climate, with industrial real estate as hot as it was, a patient seller could extract 28 or even 30 million without straining. But when my eyes landed on the final agreed purchase price, my vision went briefly unfocused, rage and bewilderment hitting at the same instant. $15 million. I leaned toward the monitor until I was close enough to count the pixels. $15 million. Nathan was liquidating the cornerstone of the company at barely 60% of its actual market worth. A financial slaughter. No businessman of any experience, however limited, authorizes a sale that voluntarily abandons $10 to $15 million in value. It violated every foundational principle of commercial real estate. I traced the timeline of the transaction through its digital signatures and notary stamps. The velocity of it was staggering. A deal of this complexity should have demanded months' due diligence, environmental assessments, structural inspections, and layers of legal back and forth. Nathan had forced the whole thing through in 12 days. He had waived the inspection windows. He had bypassed the firm's standard internal legal review entirely. He was moving the crown jewels of a 30-year enterprise, the way a desperate man pawns a stolen watch, fast, cheap, no questions. The closing date was set for this coming Monday. The wire was scheduled to land in the corporate escrow account within 48 hours. He was racing toward a catastrophic discount, dismantling the foundation of his own inheritance just to get $15 million into his hands as quickly as possible. I pushed back from the desk and got to my feet, the four walls of that hotel room suddenly pressing in. I crossed to the window and back again, staring out at the city lights scattered across the dark. The logic of it was assembling itself cold and precise in my head. Why would an ambitious, acquisitive young man deliberately torch his own future wealth? The answer was not complicated. He wasn't thinking about the future anymore. He was trying to survive the week. You don't accept a 60% haircut on prime real estate unless your back is so far against the wall you can feel the bricks. Nathan hadn't set out to take over the company because he wanted to run it. He was in immediate, crushing financial danger. He had dug himself into something so dark and deep that the only exit he could find was to detonate my life's work and ride the blast out. He needed an 8-figure sum in hand by Monday morning, and he was prepared to commit elder abuse, manufacture fraudulent medical documents, and execute wholesale fraud to get there. I stopped at the window and pressed my forehead to the cold glass. The betrayal went deeper now than money. It was the contempt embedded in it. He was treating everything I had bled for, every year, every sacrifice, every unglamorous hour, as a disposable resource to absorb the cost of his own catastrophic decisions. He imagined me safely installed in some sterile care facility, medicated and oblivious while he sold off my legacy to the lowest bidder. He believed he had outmaneuvered the old man, but he had left a digital trail wide enough to drive a truck through, and he had made a fundamental error in judging my willingness to fight. I returned to the desk and looked at the glowing screen. $15 million pending Monday morning. I could have frozen the escrow account at that very moment, called the bank, killed the wire. But that only treats the symptom. The disease would still be running. I needed to know exactly who was purchasing those warehouses, and I needed to understand precisely what Nathan owed $15 million to cover. I couldn't get there alone. I needed someone on the outside who knew the legal terrain the way I knew commercial property. I needed a predator. I reached past my main phone in the travel bag and pulled out the cheap, prepaid burner I had always kept for moments like this. It was time to bring in the wolf and to pull every last thread of the story my son had been spinning before Monday arrived. I pressed the buttons on the burner phone and dialed a number I hadn't needed to look up in 40 years. 2 rings before a gravelly voice picked up. Conrad Whitfield did not waste time on pleasantries. He was a 70-year-old corporate attorney who had worked through the bloodiest mergers and acquisitions in Texas history. We had crossed paths in our late 20s, 2 hungry men cutting their own paths into the world. He was the only person I trusted completely with my life, my finances, and the things I never said out loud. I kept it short. I told him Nathan had locked me out of the house, forged a medical power of attorney, and was actively selling the South Houston distribution centers at a 60% discount. The line went dead quiet for 5 full seconds. I could make out the faint bleed of traffic noise in the background. Then Conrad asked me where exactly I was. I gave him the downtown hotel address and my room number. He told me to get some coffee and ended the call. Fewer than 45 minutes later, a sharp knock cut through the silence of my hotel room. I pulled open the door and found Conrad standing in the hallway, dressed in a navy suit and gripping a massive leather briefcase. His hair had gone silver, but the man still carried the raw, imposing weight of a silverback gorilla. He moved inside without ceremony, those sharp eyes scanning the sterile furnishings and the laptop burning bright on the small desk. He offered nothing in the way of comfort. Not a word about the stroke, not a question about how my heart was holding up under the weight of this betrayal. Conrad understood that sympathy has no place on a battlefield. Instead, he hoisted the briefcase onto the mattress, threw the brass latches open, and started laying out thick legal pads, encrypted drives, and a portable scanner. We shoved the desk to the middle of the room and turned it into a command center. I put in an order for black coffee and we got to work. The distance between my actual reality and the fiction my son had built was almost laughable. Nathan and his wife Paige were likely back at my estate right now, entertaining guests in the warm evening air, perfectly satisfied that the old man was parked in some grim assisted living facility, sedated and neutralized. They were certain the old man had been removed from the board. What they could not have known was that their scheme had just roused two of the most hard-edged veterans in Houston commercial real estate. We were not resting. We were arming ourselves methodically, deliberately preparing to tear apart every brick of the arrogant empire of illusion Nathan had constructed. Conrad dragged a chair up to the desk, plugged his encrypted drive into my laptop, and piggybacked off the ghost protocol. As a former federal prosecutor, Conrad carried a rare and unsettling gift, the ability to read past the surface of financial documents straight into the intent behind them. He never just looked at the numbers themselves. He looked at what the numbers were trying to say and what they were trying to hide. While I had been fixated on the pending warehouse sale, Conrad launched a rapid forensic audit of Nathan's digital footprint over the previous year. He pulled personal expense reports, cross-referenced them against corporate credit lines, and began charting the precise arc of my son's desperation. The hotel room grew close and warm, heavy with the smell of roasted coffee and the low, steady hum of the laptop fan. We fell into a rhythm, the silent, efficient synchronization of two old soldiers who had fought beside each other through 100 different battles. I would surface the internal routing numbers. Conrad would thread them through the external banking networks. For 3 solid hours, the only sounds in that room were the hard clatter of keyboards, the whisper of papers shifting, and the occasional sharp exhale from Conrad whenever another piece of the puzzle snapped into place. He was cutting through Nathan's financial life with surgical precision. He started with the $500,000 in missing operating cash. Within 20 minutes, Conrad had systematically dismantled the fabricated consulting invoices Nathan had fed into the system. Running the routing numbers through his proprietary legal database, Conrad established that the shell companies receiving those payments were no consulting firms. They were offshore holding accounts registered in the Cayman Islands accounts, built specifically for their impenetrable opacity and their well-documented role in concealing illicit money from domestic authorities. Nathan was not simply stealing. He was systematically laundering corporate funds across international borders. But Conrad was not finished. He eased back in the chair and rubbed his chin, eyes fixed on the screen, working through it. He observed that moving $500,000 offshore was a serious federal offense, but it still did not account for the sheer panic behind selling the South Houston warehouses for $15 million by Monday morning. The offshore transfers were clumsy cash concealment. The real estate liquidation was something else entirely, a desperate bid to generate enormous capital, and fast. Conrad pulled up the pending purchase agreement for the warehouses. He scrolled past the financial terms entirely and went straight to the buyer's information. The purchasing entity was listed as a limited liability company incorporated in Delaware, a state long celebrated for allowing its corporate owners to remain completely invisible to the public. Most people would have walked straight into a dead end at that point, but Conrad Whitfield was not most people. He cracked open a private legal registry he kept for corporate espionage work, stepping around the public records and drilling down into the registered agent filings. I watched his face as the data filled the screen. The grim, locked-in expression he had been wearing for the last 3 hours dissolved, replaced by something I had almost never seen on that man's face: raw shock. He turned toward me, slowly, pulling his reading glasses off. He said my name in barely more than a whisper, his voice carrying a tension I had never heard from him before. He told me I had to see the screen. He had found the registered agent for the shell company. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place all at once, locking together into a picture so grotesque and contorted, it knocked the air straight out of my lungs. I leaned over the makeshift desk, my eyes moving along the lines of data Conrad had highlighted on his encrypted screen. The room was absolutely still, except for the soft hum of the laptop and the distant cry of a police siren drifting up from the Houston streets below. My heart was beating a slow, heavy cadence against my ribs as I read the name listed as the registered agent for the Delaware Limited Liability Company. It was not some faceless corporate conglomerate. It was not a rival developer swooping in to scavenge a bargain. The name staring back at me in cold white letters was Brendan Osgood. I blinked. A chill moved across my skin. Brendan Osgood was no titan of industry. He was a 28-year-old failed graphic designer who spent most of his time hitting his sister up for loans to prop up one doomed startup after another. His sister was Paige, my daughter-in-law, the same woman who had stood on my front porch just hours earlier in her pressed linen sundress, wearing a mask of manufactured concern, telling me I needed to be locked away in a care facility. Conrad let out a low, humorless laugh, the kind that sounds like gravel being dragged across stone. He leaned back, crossed his arms over his chest, and broke down the entire scheme with the cold, clinical detachment of a seasoned prosecutor laying open a murder case. They were not selling the South Houston distribution centers to some outside buyer to raise capital. They were selling the crown jewels of my empire directly to themselves. A textbook shell game engineered to strip my most valuable assets from the corporate portfolio and tuck them safely behind an anonymous corporate veil, one controlled entirely by Paige and her family. I sat staring at the screen, my mind struggling to absorb the sheer audacity of what I was looking at. Conrad walked me through the mechanics step by step. They had incorporated the Delaware Shell Company exactly 3 weeks ago, right around the time I first began complaining of chest pains. The timing was no coincidence. It was a calculated, coldly malicious contingency plan. By setting the sale price at a deeply discounted $15 million, they were engineering a catastrophic paper loss for my company. But the true twisted genius of the scheme lived entirely in the mechanics of the financing. Conrad surfaced another hidden document, a loan origination file attached to Brendan's shell company. They had secured a $15 million private equity loan to fund the purchase using the warehouses themselves as the primary collateral. They were in essence leveraging my own buildings to guarantee the money they needed to buy those same buildings from me. Once the transaction closed Monday morning, the $15 million would be wired directly into our corporate escrow account. Under the forged power of attorney, Nathan would immediately have full, unrestricted, and unchallenged access to every last cent of those funds. Conrad pressed a thick, calloused finger against the screen. He laid out the endgame. Nathan and Paige would move that $15 million straight out of the corporate account and into their untraceable offshore positions in the Cayman Islands. They would disappear with the liquid cash, leaving my company hollowed out and bleeding. Meanwhile, Paige's brother would be sitting on $25 million worth of prime commercial real estate in South Houston. Even with the $15 million loan attached to it, They had manufactured $10 million in pure laundered equity for themselves out of nothing. It was a masterpiece of corporate theft. The full weight of what I was looking at hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. This was not a panicked move made by a desperate son in over his head. This was a sophisticated, deeply premeditated criminal conspiracy. Nathan and Paige had sat at my dining room table for Sunday dinners, smiling, asking me to pass the wine while secretly building an elaborate financial guillotine designed to separate me from everything I had ever built. What Conrad was about to lay out on that hotel desk went far deeper than anything I had braced myself to hear. The full picture of what had been done, and who had helped do it, was about to land all at once. So let me ask you this: if you discovered someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them immediately? Or would you wait and build your case in silence? Paige had willingly pulled her own brother into this, turning the systematic destruction of my life's work into some kind of twisted family venture. I thought about everything I had done for Paige and Nathan over the years. I remembered quietly clearing Paige's enormous credit card debts right after the wedding, never once mentioning it to a soul. I remembered bringing in the finest contractors in the state to build their custom home, the very house where they were now celebrating what they believed was my collapse. I had treated her as if she were my own blood, and she had repaid that with a coordinated takeover of my entire existence, using her own sibling as the instrument to execute it. The deep sorrow that had been pressing down on me began to burn away, replaced by something cold and crystalline, a fury refined to its purest form. The betrayal was so complete, so thoroughly rotten, that it cut through whatever threads of feeling I still had for the boy I had raised. Nathan was no longer my son. He was an adversary. Paige was not family. She was a parasite. And I was about to remind both of them exactly what kind of man had built the empire they were scrambling to steal. I looked back at Conrad. The attorney sat watching me with quiet, absolute understanding. He knew the crushing weight of what I was working through. I asked him the only question that still mattered, whether we had enough hard evidence to halt the transfer before Monday morning. Conrad shook his head slowly. Stopping the wire, he explained, would only ignite a long and grinding legal war. Nathan still held the forged power of attorney. If we blocked the sale now, he would panic and run. We had to let the trap close all the way. We had to let them win today. I stared at Conrad, trying to grasp the full gravity of what he was telling me. Letting them win meant watching $15 million built through 40 years of relentless work slide straight into the hands of my treacherous son and his scheming wife. It cut against every instinct I had sharpened over 4 decades in the brutal world of commercial real estate. When you catch a thief with his hand in your pocket, you break his fingers. You do not stand back and watch him pull the wallet free. But Conrad raised a hand, urging me to hold steady. He laid it out. If we acted too soon, if we simply blocked the escrow transfer and put the shell company documents in front of Nathan, we would only have evidence of an attempted corporate manipulation. Nathan could argue it was an aggressive but legitimate restructuring strategy. He could bring in expensive lawyers, bury the company in litigation, and drag my name through the mud while I fought a punishing battle in civil court. Conrad leaned in close, his eyes going narrow and cold. He told me that to put Nathan away for good, to guarantee federal prison rather than a civil lawsuit the wire transfer had to go through. Federal wire fraud is only a fully consummated crime once money actually crosses state lines under false pretenses. But that still left the most critical question hanging unanswered. Why was Nathan doing this now? Why force a massive real estate liquidation at 60 cents on the dollar, risking exposure and total ruin, just to move $15 million offshore? He already had a multi-million-dollar trust fund. He drew a 6-figure salary. He lived in a house I had paid for. The pieces were all on the table, but the picture at the center was still buried in shadow. Conrad turned back to his encrypted laptop, his fingers hitting the keys with a fresh, driven intensity. He said that a man only burns down his own castle when something far worse is already threatening to breach the walls. He began tracing the digital trail backward from the offshore Cayman accounts, hunting for the original spark that had set this desperate fire. It took him nearly 2 hours of burrowing through hidden servers and bypassing layered firewalls before he found the source of the rot. When he finally brought the hidden ledger up on screen, the room went very still. Conrad angled the laptop toward me, his face completely unreadable. It was a digital statement from an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. I am an old-school real estate developer. I understand bricks, steel, concrete, and long-term leases. I never trusted digital currency, and I had explicitly forbidden the company from touching speculative crypto investments. But my son, always certain he was the sharpest mind in the room, had brushed my mandates aside entirely. Conrad pointed to a series of enormous transactions executed 3 months ago. Nathan had not simply bought cryptocurrency. He had gone into something called high-risk margin trading. He had borrowed a staggering sum to place a massively leveraged bet on a volatile digital asset, convinced he could double his net worth overnight. But to secure that kind of financing from an unregulated shadow syndicate, he needed collateral. My blood went cold as I looked at the collateral documents tied to the digital loan. Nathan had secretly pledged the corporate assets of Drummond Commercial Real Estate and Logistics as the backing for his personal gambling habit. He had forged my signature to guarantee the debt. Then the market collapsed. The digital asset cratered, triggering an immediate and devastating margin call. Nathan was wiped out completely. The screen displayed the final ruinous balance. My son owed $12 million to a shadow syndicate of unregulated offshore lenders. These were not conventional bankers who would sit down over golf and quietly discuss restructuring terms. They were faceless, dangerous entities whose only specialty was recovering what they were owed by whatever means it took. And suddenly, the entire elaborate scheme snapped into perfect, horrifying focus. The panic, the rush to have me declared mentally incompetent, the fire sale of the South Houston warehouses to his brother-in-law. They had not driven me out of my own home to absorb my company and steward my legacy. They had driven me out because the wolves were already circling at the door. Nathan needed $15 million by Monday morning, $12 million to settle the debt, and the remaining $3 million to disappear. He and Paige were planning to leave the country, slipping away to a non-extradition jurisdiction where they could live quietly on what they had taken. But the true cruelty of their plan was the wreckage they intended to leave behind. By leveraging my company to secure the debt and executing the fraudulent sale in my name under that forged power of attorney, they had legally positioned me to take the full weight of the fall. When the dust settled and federal investigators came knocking, they would find a gutted corporation, massive fraudulent transfers, and my forged signature on every document in the file. Nathan was planning to leave his own father to face the federal government, the creditors, and the total obliteration of our family name while he sipped cocktails on a private beach somewhere. He was going to let me die in a federal prison hospital just to escape the wreckage of his own catastrophic stupidity. I pushed back from the desk and stood my legs feeling like they were filled with concrete. I crossed to the window and looked out at the city I had spent a lifetime helping to build. The ache in my chest was sharp and undeniable, but it was no longer heartbreak. It was the cold, concentrated clarity of a man who understood he was fighting for his life. I turned back to Conrad and gave a slow nod. The silence between us stretched dense with the weight of everything we had uncovered. Conrad shut the encrypted laptop with a firm, decisive snap and looked at me, his jaw set hard. He reached into his pocket and produced his phone. He told me he was ready to call his best contacts at the FBI right now. Between the forged medical documents and the offshore shell company records, we had enough circumstantial evidence to secure an emergency injunction and freeze the Monday morning transaction. He pressed me to lock down the assets immediately and hand the entire wreckage to federal prosecutors before Nathan could trigger a debt collapse on my company. I reached out and laid my hand firmly over his. I met the eyes of the man who had stood beside me in boardrooms for 40 years, and I shook my head. "No," I said, barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of something final. "Do not make that call. Not yet." Conrad frowned, his hand suspended over the keypad. He pushed back. "We were playing a dangerous game," he said. He reminded me that $15 million was set to land in our corporate escrow account the moment the bank opened Monday morning. He warned that if Nathan managed to authorize the outbound wire to the Cayman Islands before we could intercept it, that money would be gone for good, swallowed by a digital black hole beyond the reach of American law enforcement, and I would be the one left holding the bag. I held my position, my grip on his hand tightening. I understood the risks clearly, but I also understood the law, and more than that, I understood the bone-deep cowardice at the core of my son. I explained to Conrad that if we called the authorities tonight, we were halting nothing more than an attempted transaction. Nathan was sharp enough to cloud the picture. He could position the warehouse sale as a legitimate capital-raising strategy during a perceived corporate emergency. He could argue that the power of attorney had been executed out of genuine concern for my deteriorating health. A skilled defense attorney could reframe all of this as a complicated civil dispute between a father and son over the future of a family business. At best, Nathan would walk away with a reprimand. At worst, he would drag my name through a decade of grinding public litigation. I moved over to the makeshift desk and stared at the dark screen of the laptop. I told Conrad that a civil dispute was not what I was after. I had no interest in a messy family court spectacle. What I wanted was absolute, unambiguous justice. And to get it, we had to let Nathan and Paige cross a threshold they could never step back from. I laid out the mechanics of the trap. The $15 million would land in the corporate escrow account Monday morning. That money technically still belonged to the company. But the real crime, the ironclad, indefensible federal offense, would only be committed when Nathan physically signed the final wire transfer authorization, moving those funds from our domestic corporate account to his concealed offshore holding company. The instant he signed that document and triggered the transfer under false pretenses, using the forged power of attorney, it would be textbook federal wire fraud. No gray area, no civil defense to hide behind. It would be a deliberate criminal act, carrying a mandatory federal prison sentence. I wanted his signature in ink. I wanted his digital fingerprint embedded in the transfer protocol. I wanted the fraud executed so nakedly that no high-priced attorney anywhere in the country could pull him back from the edge. I was prepared to put $15 million on the line to ensure the man who tried to dismantle my life spent the next 20 years inside a federal penitentiary. Conrad studied me in silence, the harsh hotel lighting carving deep shadows into his weathered face. He was a hard man, but even he seemed unsettled by the sheer coldness of what I was proposing. He lowered his phone slowly and slid it back into his jacket pocket. He asked whether I was genuinely prepared to take this gamble. He reminded me we were working on an almost impossibly thin margin of error. If the banking system processed Nathan's outbound wire before our countermeasures were in place, the empire I had clawed out of nothing would be erased entirely. I returned to the window, looking out at the glittering sweep of the Houston skyline. I had spent my life building those lights. I was not going to let a parasite snuff them out. I told Conrad I was certain, I had come through poverty market collapses and a stroke. I was not about to let a spoiled child and his scheming wife beat me at my own game. We were going to sit in that hotel room, drink terrible black coffee, and watch the clock count down to Monday morning. We were going to let Nathan believe he had won. Let him savor the victory, let him pack his bags, let him walk all the way to the finish line. And then, at the very last possible moment, we were going to pull the floor out from under him. Conrad exhaled slowly, a long, heavy breath, a grim smile finally working its way across his face. He settled back at the desk, opened the laptop, and told me we had a great deal of work to do to prepare the kill switch. I stood behind his shoulder in silence, watching the lines of data begin populating the screen once more. We had 48 hours until the banks opened. 48 hours before my son would unknowingly sign his own fate. The trap was set, and I was holding the lock. Conrad leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes, and finally gave voice to the question that had been hanging in the air between us. He asked how I planned to stop a digital transaction that executes in milliseconds. A forged power of attorney, as far as the bank's automated systems were concerned, was a perfectly valid instrument. Conrad argued that human intervention would be far too slow to intercept a wire of that size. He said we needed something immovable, a hard barrier that could not be bypassed. I gave him a cold smile that felt unfamiliar on my own face. I told him the barrier was already there, built into the foundation of the company itself. I asked Conrad if he remembered the corporate restructuring we completed exactly a decade ago. He frowned, his mind sorting through years' worth of legal battles. I reminded him of the year my wife died, the year I was forced to confront my own mortality, and began paying close attention to the people Nathan was surrounding himself with. I had watched too many prosperous families tear themselves to pieces, with greedy heirs liquidating carefully built fortunes the moment the patriarch was gone. I made a decision then that I would never allow my legacy to be picked apart by a careless successor. So I directed our outside legal counsel in Washington to bury a highly classified contingency clause deep inside the company's master operating agreement. I called it the poison pill. Conrad's expression shifted, his mind locking onto the concept. A poison pill is a corporate defense mechanism designed to make a company unattractive to a hostile acquirer. But I had adapted the structure to guard against a personal threat. I walked Conrad through the exact mechanics of the clause. I had embedded a rigid financial covenant directly into our primary federal banking charter. The rule was absolute, with no exceptions built in. If any executive board member or any individual holding a power of attorney attempted to liquidate corporate assets exceeding 30% of the company's total net worth within a single fiscal quarter, the system required a very specific secondary authorization. A signature alone, forged or genuine, was wholly insufficient. A standard notary stamp was worthless. The bank's master protocol required my physical biometric verification, a live fingerprint scan confirmed in person at the regional federal bank headquarters, alongside a specialized notarized affidavit establishing my uncoerced consent. Nathan had no idea this clause existed. He had been operating on the arrogant assumption that his forged medical document handed him the keys to everything. He believed the power of attorney was an unbreakable shield, but he had never bothered to read the foundational bylaws of the empire he was so hungry to inherit. Conrad's eyes widened as the full architecture of the trap became clear to him. He recognized that the sale of the South Houston distribution centers, priced at $15 million, crossed the 30% threshold of our current liquid valuation precisely. Nathan was walking straight onto the trigger plate of a massive financial landmine. I took Conrad through exactly what would unfold on Monday morning. Nathan would log into the executive banking portal. He would confidently upload the signed purchase agreement from his brother-in-law. He would attach the fraudulent power of attorney. He would initiate the $15 million wire transfer to the offshore Cayman account, fully convinced he was moments away from a life of effortless freedom. The bank's automated system would receive the request and immediately scan the master operating agreement for compliance. It would detect the massive asset liquidation at once. It would search for my biometric verification. When it found no matching fingerprint, the system would not simply decline the transaction. It would automatically trigger a catastrophic loan call. A loan call is the financial equivalent of detonating a charge. The federal bank, registering a massive unauthorized liquidation of collateral assets, would immediately declare the company in critical default. Every line of credit, every corporate mortgage, and every operational account tied to the Drummond name would be frozen instantly and permanently. The $15 million would be locked inside a federal holding vault beyond anyone's reach. But the damage would not stop there. The automated security protocols would generate a high-priority suspicious activity report, flagging the entire transaction as a potential large-scale fraud and money laundering operation. The system would route these reports automatically to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Nathan would not simply fail to collect his money. He would accidentally seal himself inside a financial vault and trip a silent alarm, one that would bring every federal agency in the country directly to his door. Conrad let out a low whistle, shaking his head slowly. He called it a masterpiece of corporate warfare. He grasped that by allowing Nathan to initiate the wire transfer, we were forcing him to personally deliver the definitive proof of his own federal crimes straight into the hands of the authorities. We had no need for private investigators or a bruising civil fight. All we had to do was sit back and let the automated banking system execute judgment on my son for his betrayal. The elegance of the poison pill was its total absence of emotion. It could not be reasoned with, bought off, or bent. I looked down at the encrypted laptop, its screen cutting through the dark of the hotel room. We had built the perfect cage, and the rat was sprinting eagerly toward the bait. I told Conrad to shut the laptop and get some rest. The hard work was done. There was nothing left for either of us to do but wait. The next 48 hours would be a punishing test of patience, a silent countdown to the complete undoing of the boy I had once loved. I settled into the chair and stared out into the deep Texas night, feeling cold anticipation take up residence in my bones. Sunday evening came on with a heavy, suffocating slowness. The weekend had been a brutal exercise in psychological endurance. I sat in the same rigid hotel chair, bathed in the pale, artificial glow of the laptop screen. Outside, the relentless Houston sun finally sank below the horizon, smearing the Texas sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Conrad had gone home several hours earlier to get some necessary rest, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet corporate suite. The room was absolutely still, broken only by the measured ticking of the wall clock. Every second that passed was 1 second closer to the federal banking system coming online. Every minute was another step toward the complete destruction of my own flesh and blood. I did not eat. I barely touched the lukewarm water sitting on the desk. My mind was wholly occupied by the chilling shape of what was about to happen. Across town, behind the thick oak doors and wrought iron gates of my custom-built estate, a very different kind of evening was underway. I did not need hidden cameras to know exactly what Nathan and Paige were doing. I knew my son. I knew how his arrogance worked. I could see the scene with perfect clarity. They were celebrating. The grand foyer of my home, a space I had designed to welcome the people I loved, was almost certainly buried under expensive, oversized designer luggage. Paige was probably moving between the master bedroom and the hallway, methodically folding silk vacation clothes, tucking away designer sunglasses, laying out expensive jewelry. They were getting ready for their escape to the Cayman Islands. I could practically hear the sharp ring of my best crystal glasses knocking together in a toast. They were without question drinking the aged single malt scotch I had been saving in the cabinet for a worthy occasion. To them, this was the worthiest occasion imaginable. They had beaten the old man. In their minds, they had pulled off the perfect crime without a flaw. Nathan was probably pacing my home office, settling into my heavy leather chair behind the mahogany desk, feeling like a titan. He likely read over the forged medical power of attorney one final time, taking quiet satisfaction in his own deception. He was genuinely convinced that the falsified dementia diagnosis was an impenetrable suit of armor. He believed he had outmaneuvered the man who had navigated 4 decades of brutal commercial real estate warfare. He and Paige were drowning in their false victory, laughing at how effortlessly they had disposed of me, completely blind to the fact that they were dancing on a floor packed with high explosives. Their pure, unguarded confidence was the exact weapon I was turning against them. Back in the cold hotel room, the physical and emotional weight of the past few days began pressing deep into my bones. My chest held a dull, persistent ache. Not the physical residue of my recent stroke. This was the agonizing emotional severing of the bond between a father and his child. I was grieving a ghost. The small boy who used to tear down the driveway to meet me when I came home from work was gone, completely gone. He had been swallowed whole by the desperate, grasping stranger currently loading bags in my house. I understood then that the cruelest part of betrayal is not what it costs you financially. It is the shattering recognition that the person you would take a bullet for is the very same person who pulled the trigger. I closed my eyes and let the final wave of grief move through me. I allowed myself one last moment of sorrow for the family I believed I had. When I opened them again, the grief had emptied out, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. The stakes of what was coming in the morning were enormous. The $15 million wire transfer was sitting in the digital queue, waiting for the bank doors to open. The moment Nathan logged in and authorized that transaction to his offshore shell company, the poison pill would trigger automatically. No warning sirens, no confirmation prompts. The federal banking system would simply close the trap. The loan call would freeze every asset tied to his name, my name, and the entire corporate structure in an instant. The automated suspicious activity reports would be dispatched immediately to the FBI. Once the sun rose, the gears and apparatus of the federal justice system would begin to turn, and nothing on this earth was going to stop them. I was holding the launch keys to a financial nuclear weapon, and my son was the one begging me to turn them. I glanced at my cell phone resting on the edge of the desk. The screen was dark and silent. Nathan had not called to check on me. He had not sent a single message to see whether his supposedly sick, mentally diminished father had arrived safely at the nursing home. He did not care whether I was lost, afraid, or dying. His silence was the final confirmation I needed. He was completely at peace with my destruction, as long as it guaranteed his own escape. He thought he was the apex predator in this story. He believed he was the wolf who had successfully cut the weakest animal from the herd, but he had it badly wrong. He was nothing more than blind prey wandering into a steel-jawed trap entirely transfixed by the bait. The digital clock in the corner of the laptop screen ticked from 11:59 to midnight. Sunday was finished. Monday had arrived in the dark. The city beneath my window went very still, as though holding its breath for the wreckage that was coming. I leaned forward in the chair, resting my hands on the edge of the desk. The waiting was nearly over. In a few short hours, the sun would come up, the banks would open their digital vaults, and Nathan would make his last, irreversible move. I fixed my gaze on the dark screen of my phone, knowing that his arrogance would drive him to make one final gesture of cruelty before he tried to disappear for good. I sat in the total silence of the room, completely ready for what was coming. The hours ground on with a punishing weight, every tick of the wall clock ringing through the barren hotel room like a hammer blow. I stayed motionless in the rigid chair, watching the shadows shift and stretch across the gray carpet as the streetlights pulsed outside. My mind held no hesitation. I had released the last of my parental mercy. I was no longer a father trying to correct a wayward son. I was a sovereign defending the territory of his life's work against an invader. The air conditioning unit kept up its low, steady drone, a monotonous accompaniment to the final hours of my former life. I knew Nathan well enough to see his last move coming. Men driven by deep insecurity always need the final word. They cannot simply collect their prize and melt into the shadows. They have to gloat. They have to make certain their victim feels the full weight of their supposed superiority. I kept my eyes on the dark face of my phone, knowing his swollen ego would eventually force him to reach out. He needed to twist the knife one last time to feed his own fragile pride. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, the pitch-black room was cut open by the sharp glare of my phone screen. The device shuddered against the scuffed laminate nightstand, shattering the stillness. I did not flinch. I did not move to pick it up. I simply turned my head and looked at the glowing notification. The name Nathan Drummond lit up the dark, a name that now felt entirely foreign to me. I reached out with a steady hand, my fingers cool and unhurried, and unlocked the screen. There it was, the message that would forever sever the bloodline between us. You are no longer part of this family. We will move on without you. Do not come back. The words sat perfectly aligned on the glowing display, carrying the cold, sterile cruelty of a corporate termination notice. I read the message 3 times, letting the full malice of it settle over me. He had sent it from inside my own home, standing in my living room, in all likelihood entirely convinced he had secured the final victory. He wanted me to spend whatever time my supposed dementia left me knowing that my own son had deliberately erased me from his life. He wanted me to feel the full, crushing weight of being discarded. But as I held those words on the screen, I did not feel discarded. I felt completely free. His text was the last piece of proof I needed that I owed him absolutely nothing. He had voluntarily walked away from his place as my son, releasing me from any remaining moral obligation to shield him from what was coming. The guilt that had been threatening to fracture my resolve dissolved, entirely replaced by a clean, undiluted focus. I tapped the reply field. The keyboard appeared, waiting. A weaker man might have fired back with a paragraph full of anger or pleas or legal threats. But I understood that any show of emotion would only inflate his ego further. It would confirm his belief that he was in control. I had no interest in arguing with a man already walking toward his own ruin. I only needed him to know that his terms had been received. I typed 4 letters. Okay. I looked at the word for a moment, struck by its quiet completeness. It was not surrender. It was a receipt. The composed acknowledgement of a general watching his enemy march into a minefield of his own choosing. I hit send. That small bubble of text floated up on the screen, a quiet permanent close to 42 years of fatherhood. I set the phone face down on the desk, cutting off the glow, and brought my full attention back to the military-grade laptop. The Ghost protocol was still running lines of code, scrolling steadily across the screen, waiting on my final command. The timeline had caught up to the present. The circle had closed. I was back at the point where this nightmare had first taken shape, but everything around it had changed. I was no longer a man reacting to an ambush. I was the architect of the response. I rested my hands on the keyboard and drew one slow breath to settle the adrenaline moving through me. The trap was already woven into the master operating agreement, but I needed to arm the poison pill manually to ensure there were no digital gaps Nathan could slip through when the banks opened. I accessed the master security console inside the hidden executive portal. I moved through 3 layers of biometric verification, confirming my identity by fingerprint and retinal scan. The system granted me full administrative control. I found the specific financial covenant governing the South Houston distribution centers. I ran a manual override command, locking the digital trigger into position. I entered the final authorization code, a sequence of numbers that existed only in my memory, and pressed the Enter key. The laptop screen flashed a solid green for a fraction of a second before settling back to the standard dashboard. A small plain notification box materialized at the center of the monitor. Override command confirmed. Security protocols armed. The point of no return had been crossed. The trap was live. The digital jaws of the federal banking system were now open, waiting for Nathan to take his final fatal step. I eased back slowly in the stiff chair, listening to the quiet hum of the laptop fan. There was no reversing any of this now. The board was set, the pieces were fixed in place, and the destruction of the son I had raised was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, and a thoroughly earned one. The first pale light of Monday morning began seeping in around the edges of the curtains, laying thin strips across the hotel walls. I had not slept a single minute. Yet I felt an unnatural charge of energy running through me. The clock on the encrypted laptop read exactly 8:00 in the morning. On the East Coast, the financial markets were already stirring, and the central servers of the federal banking system were spinning up. I sat without moving, my eyes locked on the master dashboard of the corporate network. The room was perfectly still, but in the digital world behind that screen, a massive storm was beginning to gather. I knew Nathan's travel schedule. He and Paige were booked on a first-class flight to the Cayman Islands, departing at 11:00 that morning. To make that flight, Nathan needed the $15 million to clear the escrow account and wrote to his offshore holding company. He would not wait a moment longer than necessary. The pressure of his $12 million debt to the Shadow Syndicate would be compressing him like a vice, pushing him to move at the earliest possible opening. He was probably sitting in the back of a luxury car on the way to the airport banking app, open thumb hovering. At exactly 8:05, the laptop screen flickered. A small pulsing yellow icon appeared in the upper right corner of the transaction log. A pending outbound wire transfer had just been initiated. The amount was exactly $15 million. The destination was the offshore shell company Conrad had uncovered. The authorizing signature on the digital request belonged to Nathan Drummond, acting under the power of attorney he had forged while I was lying in a hospital bed. I leaned forward, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. He had done it. He had taken the bait without any idea whatsoever of the steel jaws waiting in the dark. For a few agonizing milliseconds, the transaction status held at yellow. The bank's server farms were working through the request, reading the routing numbers, confirming the available balance, authenticating the power of attorney. Under normal circumstances, that yellow icon would simply turn green. The money would evaporate into the digital ether, and the empire I had spent 40 years constructing would absorb a blow it could never recover from. But this was not a normal set of circumstances. I held my breath, watching that small yellow circle pulse on the screen. Then, without warning, it vanished, replaced by a hard red warning triangle. The system had found the wall. The automated intelligence of the federal banking network had scanned the transaction and recognized immediately that a $15 million liquidation far exceeded the 30% threshold of the company's net worth. The poison pill protocol engaged with a cold mechanical efficiency. The system went looking for the mandatory secondary authorization. It scanned for my physical biometric fingerprint and the specialized notarized affidavit establishing my uncoerced consent. When it found neither, the banking core did not simply reject the transfer. It responded exactly as it had been designed to respond to a massive, unauthorized breach of protocol. The screen erupted in a cascade of automated alerts. The status of the $15 million shifted instantly from pending to frozen. A secondary alert confirmed that the loan call contingency had been successfully triggered. In a matter of seconds, the bank suspended every operational account, every corporate credit line, and every credit card associated with Drummond commercial real estate. The vast vault doors of my empire slammed shut from the inside, sealing Nathan's stolen funds inside an impenetrable federal holding cell. But the guillotine had not finished its drop. By attempting to push that volume of money offshore under a flagged protocol, Nathan had tripped the highest-level security wire in the American banking system. Confirmation receipts scrolled rapidly across my screen as the bank's automated compliance engine generated multiple suspicious activity reports. These were not internal memos. These were high-priority, legally mandated alerts, triggered by suspected large-scale financial crime. I watched in grim concentration as the system assembled the package, the forged power of attorney, the details of the offshore Cayman account, the connection to the Delaware shell company, managed by Page's brother, and the $15 million wire request. Within seconds, those comprehensive dossiers were transmitted to the secure servers of the FBI's white-collar crime division, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Treasury Department. Nathan believed he was quietly walking off with his inheritance. Instead, he had just broadcast a meticulously assembled confession of federal wire fraud and international money laundering directly to the most powerful law enforcement bodies in the country. The federal trap had closed with bone-crushing finality. I let the breath out slowly. The red warning alerts sat frozen on my screen, a stark and arresting testament to what thorough preparation can accomplish. The money was safe. The company, though temporarily locked down, was fully protected from his destructive reach. I shut the laptop and pressed a hand across my tired face. There was no feeling of triumph in this. There is no satisfaction in watching your own son demolish his life, even when he has earned every consequence headed his way. The silent hotel room felt colder than it had before. The digital strike had landed without a hitch, but the human wreckage was only now beginning to take shape. At this very moment, Nathan was probably slumped in some VIP lounge at the airport, phone in hand, staring at a declined transaction notice he couldn't begin to process. He was sitting on $12 million in debt to dangerous men. His getaway money was frozen under federal lock, and the FBI had his name open on a desk somewhere. The clock on the wall ticked forward. It was time for the final confrontation. The sun had come up fully over Houston, throwing a hard, bright glare across the towering glass facades of George Bush Intercontinental Airport. Inside the terminal complex, the energy was that familiar cocktail of controlled chaos and conspicuous wealth. Nathan and Page pushed through the automatic sliding doors of Terminal D, looking exactly like what they wanted the world to think: they were young, flush, untouchable. Page moved through the concourse in designer resort wear, pulling matching leather luggage behind her, while Nathan strode alongside in a tailored suit, carrying himself with the entitlement of a man who believed he'd already won. They walked past the long, winding lines of economy travelers without a second glance and headed straight for the exclusive first-class check-in desk. Nathan practically dropped his passports and the heavy corporate platinum card onto the polished granite counter, telling the agent to run the final upgrade fees and international departure taxes for their flight to the Cayman Islands. The ticketing agent drew the heavy metal card through the reader. The machine answered with a sharp, flat beep. She frowned, offered a small apology, and tried again. Same sound. She looked up at Nathan, her practiced smile beginning to slip. "I'm sorry, sir, this card isn't going through. Do you have another form of payment?" Nathan gave a short scoff and rolled his eyes with visible irritation. He told her it was a routine security flag triggered by the international destination, nothing more. He reached into his designer wallet and produced his personal black card, a line of credit wired directly to the corporate accounts. He held it out with a dismissive flick of the wrist. The agent swiped the second card. The machine beeped again, throwing up the exact same error. Paige shifted on her feet and cut a quick glance around the VIP lane to see who might be watching. The confident set of Nathan's jaw had started to crack. He pulled both cards back off the counter, color rising in his face. He told the agent to hold their bags while he contacted his private wealth manager to straighten out what was obviously a system error. He stepped away from the counter, fingers flying across his phone screen. He opened the encrypted banking app he'd used less than an hour earlier to initiate the $15 million wire transfer punched in his credentials, and braced to see a zero balance and a successful pending transfer. The screen filled with red instead. Access denied. Account suspended by order of primary account holder. Nathan went completely still. The roar of the terminal, every announcement, every rolling bag, every passing conversation dropped away into a ringing, hollow silence. He refreshed the app. Access denied. He switched to his personal checking account. Access denied. He tried his savings. Access denied. A cold, suffocating surge of pure terror moved through him. The $15 million wasn't sitting in an offshore account. It was locked solid, and the only person on the planet with the biometric authority to trigger that kind of total systemic shutdown was the man he'd left for dead. I sat in the quiet hotel room, watching my phone screen when it suddenly lit up. Nathan's name was on the display. I didn't answer. I let it ring through to voicemail. I wanted to hear every stage of his unraveling play out in real time. A minute passed, and the first voicemail notification chimed. I pressed play, holding the phone to my ear in the silence of the room. Nathan's voice was tightly wound, wrapped in a thin coat of forced authority. "Dad, I'm at the airport, and there's a major glitch with the corporate accounts. The banks locked me out. I need you to call the wealth manager right now and authorize an override. Call me back immediately." He still thought he had the wheel. He still saw me as the frail, disoriented old man who could be steered with a firm voice. I set the phone down and left it there. 5 minutes later, it rang again. Then again. Then 5 more times in rapid succession. I didn't pick up once. By the 10th missed call, the tone of his voicemails had shifted dramatically. All that polished arrogance had drained away, replaced by a climbing, frantic edge. "Dad, where are you?" I called the assisted living facility, and they said you never checked in. "What did you do to the accounts? The wire transfer didn't go through. You have no idea what position you're putting me in right now. Pick up the phone." He was beginning to understand that the old man wasn't simply disoriented. The old man was fighting back on purpose. The calls kept coming in waves, relentless digital desperation. 20 calls. 30 calls. I listened to his voicemails as he wore a path through that airport terminal, his entire world buckling around him. By the 25th call, every trace of anger had dissolved into something raw and exposed. "Dad, please. I'm begging you. You have to unfreeze the accounts." Paige is in tears. "The ticketing agents are calling security because we can't move our bags. You're destroying my life. Please just pick up. I'll explain everything, I swear it. Just fix the bank." But it was the 43rd voicemail that finally laid bare the absolute terrifying reality of where he stood. His voice had shed every layer, not a demand, not a plea. Just a breathless, broken whisper from a man staring straight down into his own grave. "Dad, they're going to kill me. The people I owe, they don't care about explanations. If that money isn't wired today, they're going to come for me. And if the bank reported the wire block to federal authorities, I'm going to prison. I've got nothing left. My cards are dead. My cash is gone. Please, I'm your son. Don't let them do this to me. Save me." I played the final voicemail twice. He was telling the absolute truth at last. The brilliant architect of a hostile corporate takeover was gone. What remained was a frightened boy who had walked into a game he never truly understood and lost every chip on the table. The trap had worked without a flaw. The system had frozen him out completely. The federal authorities were undoubtedly closing in, and the shadow syndicate was waiting in the dark. I looked at the 43 missed calls burning on my screen. It was time to finally pick up. I walked over to the small coffee maker sitting on the hotel counter. I set a plain ceramic mug under the spout and pressed the brew button, watching dark liquid rise slowly inside it. The rich smell of roasted coffee spread through the room, carrying a strange grounding sense of the ordinary into a Monday morning that was going to be anything but. The phone on the desk buzzed again. The 44th call. I lifted the warm mug, took a slow and deliberate sip of the bitter coffee, and walked back to the makeshift command center. I picked up the phone, swiped the green icon, and brought it to my ear. No greeting. No fatherly opener. I just stood at the window and listened to the noise pouring through the speaker-muffled terminal announcements echoing overhead, the hard clatter of luggage wheels crossing polished tile, and the rapid, ragged breathing of my son. For a few agonizing seconds, Nathan didn't realize the call had gone through. He was still muttering under his breath, spitting panicked words at his wife. Then the line went dead silent as he checked the screen. "Dad." He screamed it so loudly and with such raw, violent force that I had to pull the phone back from my ear. "Dad, what did you do?" "Unfreeze the accounts right now. You need to call the wealth manager this exact second and tell them it was a computer mistake. Tell them my medical power of attorney is perfectly valid. Tell them to push the international wire through immediately. I am not playing games with you. Unfreeze the money before you ruin everything." His voice was nothing I recognized. The arrogant vice president who had stood blocking my front door just 3 days ago had vanished entirely. In his place was a cornered animal, snapping, snarling, because he could finally feel the cold steel teeth of the trap biting hard into his leg. He wasn't asking for my help. He was demanding my total submission, clawing at the crumbling fiction that he still had any power over me whatsoever. I took another slow, unhurried sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my dry throat. I turned toward the large glass window and took in the Houston skyline, that beautiful city I'd built something real inside through decades of honest grinding work. When I spoke, my voice carried the absolute stillness of a man who was holding every card. I told him I hadn't done a thing, Nathan. The federal bank simply followed the rules I laid down. You see, when an executive attempts to quietly liquidate 30% of my entire corporate net worth without my physical biometric fingerprint, the system locks itself down automatically. It's a fail-safe clause I installed in secret over 10 years ago. A poison pill. You would have known all about it if you'd ever actually bothered to read the corporate bylaws instead of spending your time engineering the theft of everything I built. The silence on the other end was thick. The noise of the busy airport seemed to pull back entirely, leaving only the sound of Nathan drawing a sharp, unsteady breath. He stammered, his mind visibly struggling to absorb what I'd just told him. "You knew." He breathed the two words like they scorched him on the way out. the full, crushing realization breaking over him that I had never once been the oblivious victim he'd counted on. I knew everything. I answered, my voice cutting straight through his shock. I knew about the forged medical documents. I knew you bribed that corrupt neurologist to have me declared mentally incompetent. I knew about the fire sale of the South Houston distribution warehouses. And I know about the Delaware shell company registered to Paige's younger brother. You genuinely believed you could sell my own commercial buildings back to yourself and quietly launder $15 million right in front of me. Nathan made a choked, strangled sound. It was the raw noise of pure terror. "Dad, please." His voice cracked into a high, desperate pitch that rang through the terminal. "You don't understand what's happening here. I owe them money, $12 million. They margin called my crypto portfolio last week. These people are going to hurt me, Dad. They're dangerous. They know exactly where I live. They know where Paige is right now. You have to let the transfer go through today. I'll pay back every cent. I'll sign the whole company over to you. Just give me the $15 million and let me get on this plane to the Cayman Islands." A heavy coldness settled into my chest. He was still trying to bargain his way out. He still believed that money thrown in the right direction could undo the wreckage he had deliberately caused. He still thought his aging father would reach down and pull him back from the violent edge he had voluntarily walked toward. I took one last long sip of my dark coffee and set the plain ceramic mug down firmly on the hotel desk. I leaned in toward the phone. I drew a slow, steadying breath and answered with quiet, ice-cold precision. "You told me I wasn't part of the family anymore. The federal bank agrees. Have a safe flight, son." I lowered the phone from my ear, standing in the stillness of that room, just listening to him screaming my name. It was a long, raw wail of total, suffocating despair. Then something in the audio shifted, and I brought the phone back. Nathan had stopped screaming. His anguished cry was cut off abruptly, replaced by a sharp, breathless gasp. The ambient noise of the terminal was broken by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots crossing polished tile. I pressed the speaker tight against my ear, stood motionless in that hotel room, and became a silent witness to the exact moment my son's entire architecture of lies came down. Through the tinny speaker, a booming, authoritative voice sliced through the crowd noise. The voice ordered Nathan Drummond to step away from the ticketing counter and keep his hands fully visible. This was not the measured tone of airport security or a gate manager. It carried the unmistakable weight of federal law enforcement. I heard the rustle of heavy gear and the sharp static crackle of walkie-talkies. Nathan answered with a pathetic, trembling stammer. He tried to summon the same arrogant authority he'd always used to flatten junior employees at the firm. He demanded to know what was happening, insisting he was a respected commercial real estate executive attempting to board a flight. He threatened to call his lawyers and have the airline buried in litigation. But his voice was shaking so badly that the threat came out sounding like a frightened child throwing a tantrum. The federal agent gave him nothing. The officer stated with flat, absolute precision that they were executing a federal arrest warrant issued by the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Right there in the middle of that crowded terminal, the agent read the charges aloud. Federal wire fraud, international money laundering, forgery of medical documents, conspiracy to commit corporate embezzlement. Each charge landed like a sledgehammer, driving another crack through the glass house Nathan had constructed around himself. I could hear the collective sharp intake of breath from the passengers nearby and the ticketing agents as the full weight of it became public. Nathan was frozen solid. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight his way out. He was caged inside a trap he had woven entirely from his own greed. And then the most bitterly poetic moment of that entire morning arrived. Paige, the woman who had stood on my front porch just 3 days ago, wearing a smug smile of conquest, understood in an instant that the luxury vessel she had climbed aboard was going down fast. The moment she heard the charges read aloud and saw the steel handcuffs come off the agent's belt, every shred of loyalty she possessed simply evaporated. Without a single beat of hesitation, she turned on her husband with the vicious speed of a cornered rattlesnake. Her voice exploded through the phone in a shrill, panicked torrent. She screamed at the agents, frantically trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and the wreckage. She insisted she had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. She cried that the whole scheme was Nathan's idea, that he had pressured her into going along, that he was completely out of control. She threw him under the bus without blinking, rapidly spilling every detail of his crimes to protect herself. She confessed on the spot that Nathan had bribed the doctor for the fake dementia diagnosis and had manipulated her brother into opening the Delaware Shell Company. She wept theatrically, claiming she was simply a frightened wife who had acted under extreme emotional coercion. Their entire marriage imploded in a matter of seconds. Nathan, completely blindsided by his wife's instant betrayal, unleashed a gut-wrenching scream of white-hot fury. He cursed her out, calling her a traitor and a gold digger, reminding her at full volume that she was the one who'd gleefully packed her designer bags for the Cayman Islands. He screamed that she was going to federal prison right beside him, their polished, flawless facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. They were no longer the gilded power couple of Houston society. They were two desperate criminals tearing each other apart in the middle of a public terminal, surrounded by armed federal agents and dozens of phones recording every second. The agents quickly ran out of patience. I heard the sharp, metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs being locked around my son's wrists. That cold, mechanical click echoed through the phone, a sound that marked the absolute and permanent end of his freedom. A second agent moved in and began reading Nathan his Miranda rights, the steady legal recitation rolling over his pathetic, breathless sobbing. He was weeping like a broken child, his spirit ground flat beneath the weight of his own monstrous arrogance. Through the chaos of Paige's hysterical screaming and the officer's firm commands, I heard Nathan whimper one last desperate plea into the open line. He called out for his dad, begging me to please wake up and tell them all it was just a terrible dream. I stood in the quiet hotel room, morning sunlight now pouring fully across the space, stinging my eyes. There was no satisfaction in my heart, only a deep, hollow exhaustion. The cancer had been cut completely out of my life. The poison was gone. I didn't say another word. I slowly brought the phone down from my ear, glanced at the call timer still ticking on the glowing screen, and pressed the red button. The nightmare was finished. I breathed deeply. Finally, 3 months later, the suffocating Texas summer heat had begun to give way to a sharp, clean autumn chill. I found myself on a hard wooden bench inside the federal courthouse in downtown Houston. The courtroom's grand architecture, soaring ceilings, heavy mahogany paneling, felt like the right stage for the final act of this whole tragic production. I was wearing my finest tailored suit, the same one I used to put on for board meetings back when Nathan was just a junior executive trying to earn my approval. I sat perfectly still, my back straight, my face giving nothing away. I was not there as a mourning father. I was there as the lead witness for the federal prosecution. The wheels of justice had moved with remarkable speed, in large part because the digital trail captured by my poison pill protocol was completely airtight. The federal prosecutors didn't need to construct a complicated story. Nathan had handed them a neatly packaged gift containing every last thread of his conspiracy. The first head to roll had not been my son's, but the corrupt neurologist who had confidently signed his name to my fraudulent dementia diagnosis. He stood before the judge, drenched in sweat, looking nothing like the smug medical professional who had casually condemned a healthy man to an assisted living facility. The prosecutors dismantled his career in under an hour. They put the financial records on the table, the substantial cash bribes Nathan had funneled into the doctor's offshore accounts. They called my primary care physician to the stand, who testified to my strong cognitive health. The medical board didn't waver. His license was permanently revoked on the spot, and he was remanded directly into federal custody to await his own trial on criminal fraud and medical malpractice charges. Watching him led away in handcuffs gave me no pleasure, only a deep, quiet sense of vindication. He had betrayed a sacred oath for a handful of silver, treating an old man's life as something cheap to be traded in the dark. But the doctor was only a warm-up act. The main event was the sentencing of the man who had drawn up the blueprints for this entire nightmare. The heavy side doors of the courtroom swung open, and 2 armed federal marshals brought my son inside. Nathan was unrecognizable. The tailored designer suits and the easy arrogance had been stripped completely away, replaced by the flat, humiliating reality of a shapeless orange prison jumpsuit. His face was pale and drawn. His eyes moved around the room in short, nervous darts, like a trapped animal scanning for an exit. He looked impossibly small. When his gaze finally found mine across the crowded courtroom, I saw a mute, desperate plea for mercy sitting behind his hollow eyes. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I returned his stare with the cold indifference of someone looking at a complete stranger. The judge read the charges aloud, his voice filling the room with absolute authority. Federal wire fraud, international money laundering, conspiracy to commit corporate embezzlement. The judge spoke directly to the calculated cruelty of the crime, how Nathan had turned the legal and medical systems into weapons against his own elderly father. No leniency was extended. The gavel came down with a sharp, ringing crack. 15 years in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of early parole. There was a brutal irony in it. The thick walls of that federal prison were the only thing standing between him and the violent syndicate he still owed $12 million to. His former life was gone permanently and completely. Paige, for her part, was waging her own desperate fight across the aisle. She had filed for divorce the morning after the airport arrest, working hard to reinvent herself as the innocent, manipulated wife who had been steamrolled by a controlling husband. She retained expensive defense attorneys, pointed fingers, and wept convincingly for the cameras gathered outside the courthouse steps. But the federal prosecutors were meticulous. They had traced the Delaware shell company directly to her younger brother, and her digital fingerprints were spread across the fraudulent loan origination documents. Her aggressive effort to throw Nathan under the bus had bought her nothing. She was formally indicted as a primary criminal conspirator. The judge ordered her assets frozen and seized her passport. She sat at the defense table, her immaculate makeup destroyed by genuine tears of fear, coming to terms with the fact that her country club life was about to be exchanged for a concrete cell. Her brother was already cooperating fully with the authorities, trading everything he knew for a lighter sentence. The poisonous alliance they had constructed to dismantle my life had consumed them both from within. As the proceedings wrapped up and the courtroom began to empty, the lead prosecutor crossed the room, shook my hand, and thanked me for my steady cooperation. I nodded, collected my coat, and walked out through the heavy wooden doors into the bright Texas afternoon. The air felt lighter. The crushing weight of the betrayal that had pressed down on me for 3 months had finally lifted. I descended the wide granite courthouse steps to the sound of distant city traffic. I had survived the most profound betrayal a man can endure. I had held the line and protected the empire I had spent my entire life constructing. The rot had been cut completely out of the foundation. The legal fight was behind me, justice had been delivered in the plain light of day, but standing on that pavement looking toward the horizon, I understood that my work wasn't entirely done. I still had to rebuild the future of my company and decide what to do with the substantial wealth that was now entirely under my control, free of the grasping hands that had tried to take it all. A new chapter was beginning to open. The very first thing I did after walking out of that federal courthouse was reclaim the physical space that had been so deliberately taken from me. I drove straight back to the custom-built estate, the same place where the locks had been changed, and my dignity had been so openly challenged on that bright morning. The heavy oak doors were unlocked this time. My legal team had already removed every remaining trace of Nathan and Paige. I moved through the grand foyer, my footsteps ringing against the hardwood floors. The house felt different. The shadow of their betrayal still clung to the corners of certain rooms, but the air felt clean and unburdened in a way it hadn't before. I brought in a professional crew to renovate the spaces they had occupied. I wanted no visual remnants of the people who had tried to erase me. I changed the heavy brass locks once more, but this time the spare keys went only to those who had genuinely earned my trust. My loyal housekeeper, who had wept when she was falsely informed I'd been sent away to a facility, came back to her post and greeted me with a warm embrace. The big house gradually became a home again. It was no longer a stronghold sheltering an ungrateful family. It was a quiet refuge, mine alone. I spent the first few weeks simply settling back into the rhythm of my own life. I woke early, drank my coffee on the back patio, and watched the sun come up over the gardens my late wife had so lovingly tended. The silence that had once felt so oppressive in that bare hotel room now felt like an extraordinary gift. I had defended the walls of my castle, and at last I could rest inside them. With my personal life back on solid ground, I turned my complete attention to the business. The twin South Houston distribution centers, the crown jewels Nathan had desperately tried to sell off for a fraction of their worth at $15 million, were officially placed back on the open commercial market. I didn't rush the process. I let my seasoned executive team carry out the proper environmental studies, thorough structural inspections, and the full run of legal negotiations. 4 months later, we closed the sale with a major multinational logistics firm for $29 million. It was a significant financial win, but the staggering number no longer carried quite the same weight for me. Those quiet nights in that hotel room had taught me something. Hoarding enormous wealth for a bloodline that had gone entirely rotten was nothing more than a fool's errand. I resolved to build a different kind of legacy altogether. I directed a substantial portion of those real estate proceeds into establishing the Drummond Foundation. We created a fully funded entrepreneurial scholarship program dedicated to underprivileged youth across the greater Houston area. I wanted to find the sharp, hungry young men and women who carried the same relentless drive I had when I was building my business up from nothing. My goal was to give them the seed capital, the hands-on mentorship, and the practical resources required to build their own empires from the ground up. These days, I spend my afternoons going through their business plans, listening to their ambitious and heartfelt pitches, watching exhausted eyes come alive with something that can only be described as genuine hope. They weren't lurking in the background, waiting for me to die so they could pocket my money. They were hungry to learn how to build their own. There is something profoundly humbling about watching a young person's entire trajectory shift because you decided to believe in what they were capable of. I came to understand that Nathan's ultimate failure was never a measure of my worth as a mentor. It was a measure of his own broken character. Through their effort and drive, my legacy would keep growing, rooted in soil that was actually capable of producing something good. I also took the opportunity to completely overhaul the executive board of my commercial real estate company. I promoted the hard-working men and women who had stood beside me through the darkest stretch, the loyal employees who had the courage to push back when Nathan briefly wrestled control of the operation away from me. I rewarded their integrity with meaningful equity stakes and permanent leadership roles. Conrad Whitfield, my razor-sharp and relentless attorney, who had engineered the entire digital trap, officially stepped away from his demanding private practice and joined my board as a senior executive advisor. We still drink bad black coffee together in the mornings, but now the conversation is about the foundation's future rather than plotting corporate countermeasures against my own blood. What I learned through all that anguish is this: the family you deliberately build around yourself is often far more solid and trustworthy than the one you simply happen to be born into. I am 75 years old, and yet I feel a renewed and unshakable sense of purpose. The mild stroke was a physical alarm bell. The betrayal was a spiritual reckoning. I no longer spend a single moment trying to earn the approval of people who see me as nothing more than a walking bank account. I guard my inner peace and my well-being with the same fierce, unyielding intensity I once reserved for protecting my financial empire. The storm that was engineered to break me only swept the road clear for something far better ahead, and that is where this story finally rests. Not in a courtroom, not in a prison cell, but in a quiet morning on a back patio, watching the sun come up over a garden planted by someone I loved and lost, and feeling for the first time in a long time that the ground beneath me was solid again. This road cost me more than I can put into words. It cost me the version of my son I had believed in for decades. It cost me sleep, my health, and months of my life spent in a hotel room with nothing but a laptop and a plan. I believe God allowed me to walk through that fire not to break me, but to burn away everything that was never truly mine to carry. What came out the other side was cleaner, stronger, and more purposeful than anything I had built before. If this story taught me anything worth passing on, it is this: protect what you build. A legacy without a safeguard is just an open door for the wrong people to walk through. Never let gratitude make you blind. Generosity is a virtue, but it must never cost you your ability to see clearly. If someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time, not the fifth, and choose the people around you deliberately. The family you build through trust and loyalty will outlast the one you simply inherited by accident. If this story moved, you leave a comment below and tell me what it brought up for you. And if you know someone who is carrying a quiet burden right now, someone who needs to hear that it is not too late to fight back, please share this with them. Subscribe to Dad Revenge so you never miss a story. These are the ones that don't get told nearly enough. Thank you for being here and for listening all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.